So, howdy-ho, everybody. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Patrick McKenzie, better known as Patty 11 on the internet. Today, we're going to be talking a little bit about journalism. I'll give a disclaimer off the top. I have a great regard for the institution of journalism. When I was in middle school, I watched Lois and Clark and thought, these are obviously equal partners in the relationship because one of them is basically a demigod and the other is the best journalist ever. I've since moderated somewhat in my point of view with regards to journalism for reasons which we will explore. This is partly a little bit of a story of an investigative journalism in progress. It's partly a lot about the epistemology of journalism coming from someone who has some weird reasons to have some knowledge of that, and it's partly about much more banking procedures and infrastructure than anyone could possibly be interested in. There's a manifold market which essentially is going to track this talk. It is on this journalism thing. Can you pull up this market for me on my phone?
Of course.
Cool. So this market was trading at 5 when I looked at it a second ago. I'm about to subsidize it with 100,000 mana of liquidity. This is a participatory talk. One, you are welcome to trade in this market. You should not expect that it will resolve in this talk, but you should expect, I hope there is market-moving information here. And two, if the market moves way away from 5 and someone notices that, I encourage you, you don't need to be recognized, just shout out 20. Okay, it's at 9 now. That's cool. And where's the subsidization button on mobile? There it is. Okay, subsidizing in 3, 2, 1, 100,000 mana, go. For those of you who don't know how subsidization works, by the way, that means like I've put up 100,000 mana for grabs, and if you attempt to grab it, you are not interacting with me. I have lost all claim to that money. Plausibly, as a result of the following, you're going to think he might be an informed trader in this market. Okay, so who is this kid? I write a little too much for the internet. My word counter is at 3.7 million words. If you need to put a number on that, 1,080,000 is the entire 6-book Harry Potter series. This only counts my publicly available words. My privately available words adds another 1 million and change. So I've written more than 5 million words. Why would I do this? Well, I'm currently on sabbatical from actual work, but I write a newsletter called Bits About Money, and I say things like banks are extremely good at tracking one kind of truth ledgers, and then write 10,000 words about that topic. I was professional, for 6 years, I worked at Stripe, including in the communications department. Mandatory disclaimer, I've quit Stripe, I'm still an advisor there, and they very definitely do not endorse anything I say in this presentation. And this is going to be a fun talk told for entertainment value in some places, and I want to make another disclaimer. We're going to discuss a news article. The news article alleges a crime. Crimes happen in the world, and they're terrible. And if someone wanders into being victimized, even if they have some amount of agency in ending up victimized, it would be ethically wrong to make fun of that person. I would never make fun of a crime victim. An interesting complicated way the story is that usually the victim is only tangentially involved in getting their story written up in the newspaper. But in this case, the victim is also the reporter of their own story. I have no compunctions about making fun of a newspaper that prints things that are untrue, and I have no compunctions about making fun of a journalist that prints things that are untrue. But there is an ethical consideration. If that market that we just showed ever resolves at 100, there is a real person in the world who very probably will lose their job, very probably will be blacklisted from their career, and very probably will lose a lot of their friends. And so one shouldn't necessarily be happy at that. And yet, this is a fun, engaging process story of how journalism is conducted, which is one reason I'm telling it. Journalism is not a secular priesthood. Journalism is a thing you can do by checking claims. And if there is a claim that is printed in a newspaper that can't survive criticism like this, that can't survive someone spending a couple dozen hours on it just on the chance that maybe the institution failed, then journalism is not serving its societal purpose. I think in our society, we see people who share our values, who look like us, who we vibe with in our social spaces, and say, they would never lie to me. Someone else has checked this, and that's how you get SBF. And so let's check some things. Now, a dash of style journalism. I don't know if you can tell this from looking at me, but I am not an avid consumer of style journalism. So I'm not an avid consumer of a publication called The Cut. So I don't know if the cut has high journalistic standards. Let's check the recent headlines. The high stakes of the group family vacation. George Clooney didn't appreciate Biden criticizing his wife. The film exec distracted by her crushes at Cannes. And of course, Madame Clairvoyant, horoscopes for the week of June 9 to 15th. Mars, planet of action, moves into steadfast Taurus. Time to knuckle down. I insist upon you, Manifold. It is time to knuckle down. In February 15th, The Cut purported to publish a story. Well, they definitely published the story. The story purports to be a first-person, extremely emotional, extremely detailed, and sometimes lurid account of being victimized by a scamming operation. I will not summarize the entire story. I actually encourage you to read it, particularly if you can read it. Just read it. It's worth it. The only load-bearing detail in this, for the purposes of this, is the day I put $50,000 in a shoebox and handed it to a stranger, I never thought I was the kind of person to fall for a scam. Wonderful title, A++ at getting virality on the internet. Anyhow, only load-bearing detail. The author says that she went into a bank and withdrew $50,000, and then she put it in a shoebox. And I'm the wire transfer compliance influencer. I do not read style magazines for anything but that hard-hitting banking procedural action. Let's look at that hard-hitting banking procedural action. Oh, yes, how I got dragged into this. My friends were like, have you seen it? It went super viral on Twitter. Hard-hitting banking procedural action. So this is a buddy of mine, Thomas Tachik. By the way, text that is ever on the screen, you don't have to read it. I'll explain the upshot to you. Thomas said, I don't really buy that Cut article. And Thomas has his own reasons for doing it. Thomas was my ex-co-founder, by the way, which is why this moved the market for me. He said, I don't think that high-value withdrawal rooms are really a thing. We'll look at high-value withdrawal rooms in a moment. But somebody pointed to Thomas's public comments and said, hey, Patrick, you are the banking compliance influencer. Are high-value withdrawal rooms really a thing? I'm like, oh, I should probably read a style magazine for the first time in my life. Okay, here is the load-bearing paragraph. We are going to examine it in detail, but I gave this about 5 seconds of consideration. Maybe I'll read it out loud for you. When I reached the bank, I told the guard I needed to make a large cash withdrawal, and she sent me upstairs. Michael, the scammer, was on speakerphone in my pocket. I asked the teller for $50,000. The woman behind the thick glass window raised her eyebrows, disappeared into a back room, came back with a large metal box of $100 bills, and counted them out with the machine. Then she pushed the stacks of bills through the slot, along with a sheet of paper warning me against scams. I thanked her and left. And from after this point, I care about nothing in the story, and I care about nothing that happened before it. I just care about, wow. So in the 5 seconds after I read this, this is what went through my mind. And let me count out 5 seconds for you. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, because this is my internal monologue. So much is wrong here. The teller didn't ask anyone to do two-person review on a large cash withdrawal. Most bank branches don't even have that much cash on hand. You have to call them in advance. Even when they do have that cash on hand, they will pretend not to have that cash on hand because it's highly likely this person is getting scammed. But wait, elsewhere in the article, it claims this is the entire balance of her savings account. And so even if she isn't getting scammed, the teller has been trained to refer her to her personal banker because it looks like she's opening a bank account at a new bank, and $50,000 in a savings account is worth $3,000 of revenue in a year. So you refer to her salesperson to try to convince her not to do that. No! Press X to doubt. I'm going to tweet confidently about this. 5 seconds later, I tweeted confidently about this. Now, I am a responsible professional, and so I didn't say, I think this is bullshit. But this rhymes with another thing, which was definitely bullshit, which is when the CEO of Mt. Gox said, the reason Mt. Gox can't send you your money, Americans, is because our bank can't process our volume of international wires. I'm like, your bank is Mizuho, the second largest bank in Japan, and the Magic the Gathering online exchange has denial of service attacks. The Japanese economy? Bullshit. Obvious bullshit. And did journalism cover itself in glory in covering that? Did Bloomberg think to call up and ask Mizuho, hey guys, heard you're having a little trouble in the wire department right now. Has the Japanese economy paused? At which point Mizuho would say, we can send you a fax with our statement. What the hell are you on? No one did that, and thus it was news to the world when it was insolvent. Anyhow.
Wait.
So a specific thing that happened. Sorry, yes?
Can you just briefly, what is the specific individual in the previous tweet? I'm like trying to read and understand your subtweet.
Me?
Like, a subclaim being made about a specific individual, is that the journalist themselves or the teller?
Oh, the subclaim is someone at the bank definitely knows if this transaction happened.
Okay.
There are many someones in the world who know if this transaction happened. So I was like, all right, game on. I just made a confident claim on Twitter, but I might be wrong on the internet, and I really hate being wrong on the internet, so we should play a game. I've played 2 games in my life. One is Dungeons & Dragons, and one is high-status prestige journalism, and they have very similar rules, so it's important to announce in advance which one you are doing. So if someone says to you, the wizard stares at you across the table. His eyes gleam balefully, and he begins a semantic gesture. What do? You say, I must be playing Dungeons & Dragons. I roll for initiative. Combat is starting. And if someone says to you, do I have it there? Yes, well, whatever. My work has previously appeared in the New York Times, and I have been on Bloomberg. I write about financial fraud, and I ask you, do you have a written statement with regards to this article which you caused to be published in the print version of New York Magazine? What do? You understand that you are playing high-status journalism and roll for initiative because combat has just started. So, Vox Media issued a statement. It's kind of magic spell, the D&D geeks know it. Anyhow, why is it Vox Media and not The Cut and not New York Magazine? Because Vox Media is a private equity firm which happens to own The Cut and New York Magazine. And so their PR department, doing the job that I used to do in a past life, is the person that needs to respond to reporters or anyone who writes in and sounds like a reporter. Now, to be clear, I have almost never done journalism in my life. I wrote one opinion piece, which appeared in the New York Times, and interviewed Matt Levine on Bloomberg once. But absolutely true statements that tell a misleading story are a recurring theme in this piece. So, and it also says that, like bluntly, I am high status, and if you don't respond to this request for comment, I can cause to be written the sentence, Vox Media did not respond to a request for comment made in business hours. And everyone who reads that sentence, if it's in one of those high-status journals, will conclude, oh, shit. So they responded, and they gave me a printable comment. The story was thoroughly fact-checked prior to publication, and as part of this process, we reviewed the writer's bank withdrawal, recordings of phone calls and text messages with their scammer, and their statement to the police. And after I received this statement, I felt chagrin, because I thought that this publication, which is a style magazine, had zero fact-checking process whatsoever, and I had confidently tweeted that out. So I did what any responsible journalist would do. I went to Twitter and said, New York Magazine says in a written statement that they thoroughly fact-checked this, which I'll mention if I write about the incident in the future. I dock myself 1 cookie. Okay, so some background information that you need to know if you want to live-action roleplay as a journalist. There are, broadly speaking, 3 ways to make comments, and these, much like Dungeons & Dragons, can be waived if the spirit moves you. On the record, this is the default, means you can quote me in print anytime. So if this presentation is on the record, and every journalist in the room is going to say, yep, it's totally on the record, because I haven't made any agreement with him, anything can be quoted in print. Off the record, which you must secure an agreement to before saying the thing that is off the record, which is the first thing you will learn in media training, means you can use the information but only attribute it to something that does not identify me, such as a person familiar with the events. And then there's another one, on background. And on background broadly means that you can use the information, but you can't reference it in print. But, as we will see later, sometimes you receive information which allows you to move your investigation forward and perhaps get documentary evidence, and the document doesn't get to claim that it's off the record. Cool. So I asked some specific questions in that email as well, in addition to asking for the written statement. And I received an email back which included that written statement and might or might not have included some other comments that might have been any combination of on the record, off the record, or on background. And there might have been a negotiation there. The world may never know. But here are the questions that I asked, because things that I said are definitionally things that I can talk about. What is the specific bank and specific bank branch that this transaction occurred at? Have you reviewed a police report or confirmed with law enforcement that this event happened? Can I have contact info of that police officer for my fact-checking process? And has the bank confirmed to you that this transaction happened, or have you seen documentary evidence of it? Now, fact-checkers, humans. Sometimes they make mistakes. And we're going to talk why that statement, which alleged 3 very specific deliverables from the fact-checker, which if you reread it really closely, might not allege the deliverables you expect it to. Maybe they placed more credence in how that should move their probability that the story was true. Probably not, because fact checkers don't have that epistemology. If the journalist is working for your publication, you generally assume they're not totally trying to punk us. I'm going through a box ticking exercise. Let's see, I probably need a police report. Give me a police report. Okay, check. And can I see some paper from the bank? Check. So my p-value, contingent on this being false, moves far less than, say, a fact checker's does. By the way, again, epistemology is very different here. I say things like, contingent on this being false, my probability value, yada, yada. A lot of New York journalism is based on, how dare he claim that this is false, which we're not doing yet. Okay, so a thing I said about bank records before I read this article to a friend was that I don't really think reviewing a bank statement is much evidence in any direction because literally a bright high schooler could forge that. So anyhow, 2014, New York Magazine wrote about this kid at Stuyvesant who was running a $78 million hedge fund. Now, pause. What's your prior that a 17-year-old is running a $78 million hedge fund? Pretty low, right? Which is why you have a fact-checking process. So they sent a fact-checker to Stuyvesant and asked him, can you please show us documents about the $78 million that you have? And he said, yes, here's my bank statement from Chase. And they were like, cool, fact-checking achieved, publish. What happened next? The author of New York Magazine profile, Jessica Pressler, says she saw the teenager's bank statements and was comfortable with the $72 million figure. As part of the research process, the claim I just said, but later he said in an interview that the statements were falsified. We were duped. Our fact-checking process was obviously inadequate. Maybe they learned a lesson in the last 10 years. Maybe not. Here's something that I view as extraordinarily weak evidence. The fact-checker said, we reviewed the text messages between the writer and the scammer. Now, granted, they are not vouching for the contents of those messages, obviously, because they're scams. They're vouching for the existence of a communication from someone to the writer. I'm going to show you a screenshot. Someone purporting to be the CIA sent me a text message this morning. But did they really? No, because 20 seconds in ifaketextmessage.com will give you exactly this output. But if you trust the writer, you will not think, all written evidence here is potentially in the possession of the adversary. But we also got recordings. Could the recording have been faked? Well, many of you are thinking, oh, LLMs can fake a lot of voices these days, but if I were doing it, I'd be a very good criminal. If I were doing it, it's much easier than using an LLM. You could do it even before LLMs existed. Go to Fiverr and say you're practicing a script and would appreciate an actor help you with a reading. Okay, here is some strong evidence, which is strongly mismodeled. The writer made a police report, and we have reviewed it. If you make a police report and put a false statement in it, that is a crime. Therefore, since no one in our social class is a criminal, everything in the police statement is true. Much like, since SBF cannot possibly be a criminal, those accounting records he has are probably not made in Excel out of his head. Poor epistemology. So here is a web page in which you can make a police report to the New York Police Department. And after you click, I understand that it's a crime to lie on this thing, there will be a text box. And you typity whatever you want in the text box. And the only thing New York Magazine is actually saying is that the reporter went typity into the text box. Oh, contingent on material claims in this article having been false. Does the possibility of taking on criminal liability mean that, would it materially change the actions of a person? I would tell you no, because contingent on the claims being false, someone has just put at risk their current job, their entire career, and most of their social network. But they're willing to go to jail. But everybody knows that the police never investigate people in our social class for filing false reports. Snap back to reality. Oh, there goes gravity. Okay, back to the text. I've highlighted some salient details here. After talking to the guard, she sent me upstairs. I asked the teller for $50,000, and we were behind thick glass. This is not when I'm giving this paragraph 5 seconds of consideration, not when I'm thinking in this frame of a high-value withdrawal room that totally doesn't exist. What is she actually recounting in a very lurid fashion? I went into a bank and withdrew money at the teller window on the second floor. I was like, oh, that's really useful information, because banks don't generally put teller windows on the second floor for a variety of reasons that you would deeply care about if your father had told you at the dinner table about how banks make real estate decisions. And if I can learn the identity of this bank, the fact that very few banks, only legacy ones they've probably had in their portfolio for 80 plus years, actually have a second floor where customers can conduct business behind thick glass, will allow me to uniquely identify the place in the world where this alleged transaction occurred. But I don't know the bank, and New York Magazine's statement does not name the bank. How could I get the bank? Well, there is a person on the internet who knows what the bank is and has a professional website because she is engaged in freelance journalism, and I sent her a letter. And game on. What's the bank? And she told me, Bank of America. Cool. Here are all the Bank of Americas in New York. That's 50, but there's only 15 in Brooklyn. Now, you might plausibly ask, but this happened on October 31st, and you were doing this research in February. Could a bank have possibly closed between October 31st and February? Again, bank transfer compliance influencer. I went to the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency because they publish a weekly bulletin about all bank branch closings in the United States, and I was prepared to read like 6 months of this bulletin, but then I thought, I have a research assistant, Sammy. Sammy will read 6 months of this bulletin, and then Sammy surprised the compliance influencer and said, they have a search engine, dude. It's very easy. No, there were only 3 Bank of America branch closings in the last 6 months in Brooklyn, and they're all very far away. Oh, easy enough. So we only have to look at 15 branches, but we have to actually go into 15 branches. Ugh, I live in Chicago. I could fly to New York and spend 3 days going into bank branches, but that's obviously an irrational use of my time. Sammy, you can fly to New York and go into 15 bank branches and write notes about this, including the call log, where you confirmed that there was no second floor at 11:20 PST on March 4th, 2024. And for the ones that did have a second floor, physically walk into them and then narrow it down to one possibility at 1 Flatbush Avenue. Samuel. So, if there was a crime, this was the crime scene. Now, one thing you might think to do at this point is straight up go to Bank of America and ask, did you give $50,000 in a shoebox to someone? And maybe some reporters have. If they did, that fact has been kept out of the reporting. Now, the job of a communications department in the financial industry is to keep your name away from bad news. And you notice the cut story doesn't mention Bank of America at all, because if there was a fact-checking process that contacted Bank of America gave something really anodyne and begged them, please don't name us. The New York Times will not allow something to run under that. They have to name the bank if they write about the story, which they did. And they got a statement from the spokesman of Bank of America. We have extensive efforts to warn clients about avoiding scams, said a Bank of America spokesman name via email. The bank declined to comment further. That does not actually mean that that was the only sentence that passed between this individual and the reporter. For example, it could have said, off the record, yeah, it totally happened. But the thing I will allow you to publish is this. Are you cool with that? Now, the New York Times says, unhedged and with no attribution, a sentence that essentially says that this actually happened. So, plausibly, they heard from Bank of America that it actually happened. But, again, style magazines, slightly different set of parameters. This is in a New York Times money advice column. And so the level of fact-checking that you have to do if you allege that like a presidential candidate has a mistress is not exactly the same as the level of fact-checking you have to do for the story. And basically, you can imagine like very plausible things where the New York Times is trusting existing publication and didn't really put this one through the ringer. Perhaps tiny mistakes were made, or perhaps this is entirely accurate. Moving on. Plausibly, you have never seen a printed screenshot of a Bank of America statement, so I have made one for you. By the simple expedient of opening an account at Bank of America and asking them to withdraw $50 so we can see the physical, technological artifact that gets created when you do this. And then, I did not edit this and put in 3 more zeros, but totally could have. Interesting point here. When you make a physical IL teller, which means I did it in Illinois, teller cash withdraw from my bank account, it lists the address of the bank thing. Now, why is that important? Oh, okay. Why is that important? So many people, on reading the story for the first time, think it's impossible to prove a negative. Like, who knows if this happened somewhere in the United States? But we're not asking if it happened somewhere in the United States. We're asking if there is a consistent story which locates it to literally like one 5-foot by 5-foot section of the United States, which is the only place it could have occurred. Sometimes journalists who make things up, like Stephen Glass, don't tell a consistent story, because who's going to check the story? And because all of us have failure to recall things. And so if I were to tell you, like, okay, I've been at Bank of America a bunch of times, and then remember a detail from that and write it down, and then tell you the address of that branch and write it down, like very plausibly I could be misremembering the address of the branch and the physical detail. And in almost all circumstances in life, that doesn't matter. But it starts to matter like a lot for this one, because if the story as written is true, they have documentary evidence that has the actual address on it. And if the documentary evidence does not say the only address it possibly could have existed at, the documentary evidence is forged. Now, I don't have any trustworthy pathway to the documentary evidence, at least at this moment. But the New York Times says that it has reviewed it. And so the New York Times has a copy. A copy that must have been created months in advance of knowing that there's only one possible place this could have been done at. Okay, another fun thing that you know if you're a bank compliance influencer, there's this thing in the world called the currency transaction report. Under the law, if you either move more than $10,000 or more into a regulated financial institution in cash or out of a regulated financial institution in cash, the bank must approximately contemporaneously report this to the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. This is a deeply private document. Let's look at a blank copy. Here's what it says. Only relevant things. Down here, what was the amount? Here was the date of the transaction. And then the financial institution when the transaction takes place, which does identify the branch by address. Now, there exists something called the Freedom of Information Act. Oh, shoot, I spoiled something. Okay, so again, these documents, deeply private, lots of personal information, your name, your date of birth, maybe your social security number, maybe your occupation, your deepest financial transactions. It would be obviously unjust if the federal government would just cough up one to anyone who asked for it. On the other hand, aggregate statistics over these. Not personally identifying, right? I mean, most people don't describe a specific transaction in enough detail to pinpoint it out of 4 million transactions filed per year. So select count as aggregate count from transactions. Join where blank and blank and blank. I predict to you that there is either 0 or 1 transactions reported from this. And then I asked FinCEN, or I will ask FinCEN, hey, could you run the SQL transaction for me and tell me what the number is? I don't know if FinCEN will actually respond to this. I don't know if they will respond to it before the heat death of the universe. But the fact of having filed the FOIA allows me to go to Bank of America, the other entity that definitely knows if the transaction happened, and said, I'm a reporter telling a story, and I've done a lot of work, and I know a lot about this, and you know exactly what story I will tell. It is a story in which you were very helpful when someone told scurrilous lies about you, or it is the other story. Okay. Disclaimer, being wealthy is fine. I've had money in life and not had money in life, and of the two, like definitely choose having money. New York journalists have an interesting culture around the topic of being wealthy. And I will admit a little bit of class anxiety, which might have been coming through in some of this talk. We're going to see some places in the article where, again, true statements are made in a way which kind of shades the truth. So, $50,000 is a lot of money. It took me years to save, stashing away a few thousand every time I got paid for a big project. The scammer asked how much money I thought I would need to support myself for a while. I don't know, 50,000? I wondered how I would receive paychecks without a bank account. Would I have to take time off work? I did some mental calculations of how much my husband could float us and for how long. Why did I hand over all of that money, the contents of my savings account, strictly for emergencies, without a bigger fight? The impression that those bits given information is, and which is referenced explicitly elsewhere in the article, is perhaps I was making other than rational decisions because my financial life was on the line. Okay, and other bits that are almost quotes from the article. My husband works at a housing nonprofit. I am a freelance journalist. I don't even have a W-2. I have to hold my own taxes until I pay them to the IRS. I have lots of anxiety about money. And here's another statement. Scam victims tend to be single, this is again from the article, scam victims tend to be single, lonely, and economically insecure with low financial literacy. I am none of these things. I'm closer to the opposite. Now, place your bets. Is this writer working poor, middle class, but dealing with financial anxiety, or, I don't know, wealthy beyond the dreams of avarice? In most cities in the United States, many things with regards to property are public records. And so, in the state, in New York City, if you have a mortgage, the entire text of that mortgage is available if someone knows your name. The name was on the internet, the records were on the internet, no login required, it literally takes 30 seconds. So, I happen to know a lot of things that are written on this individual's mortgage, which is with Bank of America, of course. Anyhow, here's where, plausibly, there was an actual crime committed. Plausibly, she was an actual victim. Just the fact of being a victim while being rich doesn't make me want to, make fun of a person. However, the journalist, which told a relatively uncritical story about a person in diminished financial circumstances, while signaling to other journalists, not really, but don't make fun of me in the office, guys. That story, no. $50,000 is not a lot of money to this individual. And that informs one of the doubts I had when I read the paragraph originally, because I took the rest of the thing at face value. Mistake. If you are actually the kind of person who only has $50,000 in your name, and you go into a bank and ask to withdraw it, the bank will have all sorts of questions. If you are a person who has millions of dollars to your name, hypothetically, and asked to withdraw $50,000 for weird reasons, the bank is not in the business of questioning rich people what they do with their money. And so that possibly explains what is still a procedural error. So where are we? We've got one world in which this article happens substantially as described. Even more than that, we're one in which there's a spectrum here. The totally lawful good version of this article, where she is actually financially struggling. I think we've comfortably excluded that. Then we've got the one, okay, I'm a little embarrassed about my professional reputation, but I did really get scammed. That part is substantially as described. And then I told the narrative of that in a way which makes sense to me. Okay. And then there are other worlds where the article is potentially not based, many fun stories to tell are based in true events and have fictional bits to them. And so going back to the banking.
30 seconds ago, it's at 44%.
Oh, wow.
Yeah,
okay.
Move to 50 as soon as you announced you were going to subsidize it.
Okay. Ooh, that's too much. All right. So the... Thanks, folks. So here's the evidence that I do not have in my hands right now, either because I haven't received it yet or haven't made the request yet. By the way, if you file a Freedom of Information Act request, get ready to wait. So we filed a Freedom of Information Act request with a copy of the New York Police Department's police report. Again, the free text that the writer put into a database. We will get an actual copy of that text. Here's something that I would be interested in seeing on that textual document, the metadata which says, when was the police report filed? Why am I interested in that metadata? The crime was on October 31st. The article about the crime was published in mid-February. Walking backwards, there was a writing process, and then after that writing process, there's the fact-checking process. And if during that fact-checking process, as you're ticking off the boxes to make sure that you've got everything from this individual trust, you say, oh yeah, and the police report? And she says, oh, right, a police report, filed under penalty of law. I was gonna do it, but I've just been so busy the last couple of months. I will file it right now. Then my probability that some fishiness is happening goes way up. If, on the other hand, the police report is filed the day after, a week after, et cetera, I don't think that's much Bayesian evidence given what we know. A bank statement, screenshot, et cetera, from the New York Times or any principal here that corresponds to something that was known that this statement was seen by someone before the publication of the article, or contemporaneous with the publication of the article before there came to be doubts. Haven't received that yet. I think I can get it from somebody. And again, if the address does not match 1 Flatbush Avenue, I will take all action below 100. If I get that SQL query done by FinCEN, and it says we filed zero currency transaction reports that day, I will take all action below 100. A statement from the Bank of America comms department. Now again, if you work in the financial industry and you're in the comms department, you're in the job of keeping you out of trouble. But there are ways to suggest as a reporter to a comms department that it is more trouble to not answer my question. And so if the Bank of America comms department says, okay, off the record, on the record, et cetera, yeah, no, it didn't happen, then I become immediately confident that it didn't happen. And then I make a phone call to New York Magazine and say, Stephen Glass situation, we need to chat. Okay. Now, the following is not trading advice. I frequently give action on places in Manifold. You should definitely transact a lot with me, particularly if I'm trying to move this market to 100%. Put like big limit orders in front of that, please. That would be bad advice. Just wanted to mention that this is the reason why making markets generally is tough in society, because you are making markets, but there might be someone who put an irrational amount of effort into learning one true thing about the world. For example, if you're making markets in Walmart, there is a person who has put an irrational amount of effort to like literally task spy satellites with like looking at Walmart parking lots and attempting to get an estimate of their quarterly numbers before those quarterly numbers are published. That is a thing that absolutely exists in the world. There is an infrastructure, a supply chain in infrastructure that is designed to make that irrational effort rational for at least hedge funds. The world of finance is wild and mysterious. Okay, so what if it actually like basically happened? I'm still going to write about this. I will still detail the fact-checking process of re-reporting a previously reported news article. It's a very different story, obviously, if it actually happened. If it actually happened, someone at Bank of America screwed up royally. Now, the thing I happen to know, again, a Japanese wire transfer compliance influencer, Bank of America has a policy with regards to large cash transactions. It's sometimes called the two-man policy. There need to be two individuals that are involved in the transaction. They need to double-check their work. There was a policy violation if it happened as described. Bank of America might or might not allocate to that. And then there are some, like fun, small questions about, okay, why didn't you ask her the purpose of this? If they had said the purpose of it, the transaction would have stopped immediately. Should have asked. Policy is to ask. Why didn't you ask? But it's like the usual story I write in Bits About Money about like fun details about the world, about banking procedure that you might not know about. In the other world, where this didn't happen, I am pretty confident there will be a retraction from New York Magazine, or at least retractions don't really happen in magazine. They'll put an editorial note on it and say, sorry, we were goofed. Anyhow, back to the style section. But it will be very consequential for a very small number of people. So that's the talk. Any questions? Can someone give me a quote of how much time we have for questions? 20 minutes, thank you.
So I think first of all, thank you. This is amazing reporting, and I love the whole thing. But you strongly implied, or maybe said outright, that the reporter was actually rich and owned property.
Yes.
And like
that is a true fact about the world.
Okay, and like, is it not the case that, like, basically couldn't every single literal detail have been true, but also the scam was like you gave it to your good friend with a promise that they'll give it back to you in a year, or like maybe you did want to give it to a friend because you were just a rich person giving $50K to somebody, and isn't like regardless of the actual, I mean, from a banking regulatory perspective, isn't like it's the truthiness is it's a scam regardless if they're rich, no? Like, they misled their audience about what was going on.
So, yes, there are ways for the transaction to have happened, and yet for there to be lies in the piece. Like, for example, nothing of this happened, but I withdrew $50,000 from my bank one day for reasons. People lie about things all the time. They lie about fishing. They lie about who they met last night. They lie about sex. They lie about money. Sometimes those lies snowball. The book, Lying About Money, talks about many people who did not set out to be financial scammers. They just wanted to impress their boss one day, and so they fudged their numbers a little bit. And after you fudge it, great quote from the series about Chernobyl, every lie told incurs a debt to the truth, and someday that debt will be paid. A lot of people continue borrowing more lies against the truth, and then the snapback is really painful. So that's the general thing. On the object level, I have some very niche interests, and I really care what happened at 1 Flatbush Avenue in a 3-minute transaction on one day in October. The rest I'm really not that interested in. So, yes?
So you have you've read "The guard sent me upstairs" to mean that there must be a second floor.
Yes.
I don't think that that necessarily follows. Many banks, especially like banks in urban areas, have steps leading up to the main teller area, either indoors or outdoors, which people would colloquially describe as going upstairs.
Please.
Please.
Yeah, short version, that wouldn't make sense for any of the banks we looked at. For all of them, we either looked at them on Google Maps or looked at them in person, or looked at them in person. None of them had that kind of steps. None of them would have guards at the bottom of that step. However, at specifically one Flatbush Avenue, there was a guard on the first floor who, had I, in principle, might have asked me to go upstairs to conduct a certain kind of transaction, and also asked me not to take photos. Sorry, man.
So I appreciate this. This is why we're being both thorough and exhaustively documenting how thorough we would be to make this stick against people, not yourself, but an important exercise here is going to high status institutions and saying we're pretty confident that you goofed, and need to be able to say you can just epistemically deny. It's extremely unlikely that wire transfer compliance influencer actually knows more about financial reporting than we do. Piss off, kid. And I need to be able to represent to them you can say that. It will not work out well for you. So, any more questions? Yes.
Have you thought of ending your sabbatical to start a competitor to Hindenburg research? Or being a professional short reporter? Usually well suited to this.
Thought about is a funny word. I think about a lot of things. I was once sitting down in Tokyo with somebody and discussing what my next thing would be, and he said, well, you're thinking of maybe starting a startup company or maybe doing a venture fund. These are boring. You clearly, he did not phrase it this cuttingly, but it was true. He's like, you clearly don't care about creating value in the world. You want to destroy someone who is wrong on the internet. I will invest in your short fund a lot. And I was like, oh, wow, okay. We'll consider it. Who knows? I think I'm probably unlikely to run a large short fund, but we shall see. There's about 15 minutes left. Cool. Oh, Vincent, you have a question yourself, then.
I have a question myself. What's your actual probability that the material fact at the center of the story is actually a lie, that she was not in fact scammed? Where are you on there?
I only want to express probabilities with respect to the bank transaction, because there are a bunch of things, and we can paint some scenarios, but then they sound a lot like, okay, these folks are debating a hypothetical about a person who might or might not be a crime victim. A scenario that could have happened, the scam started, text messages really happened, the call really happened. Hypothetically, if you're in reporting, this is excellent content because it's on your beat. And it's easy to tell one fib, right?
She withdrew only $8,000 or something.
And then people around you start acting like you're telling the truth because they assume that you're telling the truth, and then they take actions based on you telling the truth. It says in the piece, someone told me to call the police after I was scammed for $50,000, and then I called the police. Now, many victims are in a state of shock after they realize they've been victimized, but you can imagine it was a fish story at one point. Then I told the police and I put a number on it. And then, of course, I had to tell people at work, and they said, oh, you have to write that up as a piece. Look at the narrative. It'll go super viral on Twitter. $50,000 is the perfect amount of money because it's enough to be relatable, but not enough to say that you are obviously super wealthy.
Okay, what about just the probability that the bank transaction as described happened? What do you think?
Based on what I currently know, 80-ish. So the market would be should be at 20 right now if it's well calibrated with me.
80% chance that it did happen.
80% chance that $50,000 was withdrawn from one Flatbush Avenue.
Okay. Are the markets updating now in response to this statement?
If not, you're bad. But no. Yeah, I could very well be this is a fun thing about trading. I could be grossly miscalibrated with respect to my the estimate that I just gave. But you can reasonably think he's grossly miscalibrated in this exact moment. but he's also like much more likely to get the true answer than other people. And so maybe I don't want to like necessarily update in response to his current approximation. By the way, I told some journalists like, one, doing this thing, and they were like, oh, cool. Like, that's normally the kind of stuff we do, but go do you. And then I said, I'm going to give it a talk at Manifest. And they're like, why would you talk about an in-progress investigation because all your competitors can scoop you? Scoop me. I have no boss. No one's going to fire me. I'm on sabbatical. This is going to be excellent story anyway. And the story has been delivered. Okay, so if you want to like independently reinvestigate this thing, like you probably have a roadmap to it already, and maybe you are better at executing on that roadmap than I do. Any other questions?
You talked a little bit about how you find needle in the haystack information.
Yep.
Of the idea. Once more to the mic, you showed a couple of techniques in finding needle in a haystack information, and that if there were 10,000 of these types of addresses, then looking for that one single transaction on the currency transaction report, that wouldn't work. But of course, because this is a ridiculous thing that almost certainly didn't happen, you don't have that option. What are other?
Again, I'm not saying it almost certainly didn't happen.
Well, I'm saying that.
Okay.
However, what are other of your favorite techniques that maybe you didn't dig into here about finding information like this from publicly available sources?
Sure. So, facts must cohere with each other, and the world has an infinite, rich set of detail to it. No, sorry, let me go with that again. Facts need to cohere with each other. The world has infinite detail in it. That detail does not necessarily have to make sense. Good storytelling, on the other, the things you present in the story have to have like a relationship with each other, and that story has to be narratively rich. Story has to make sense. So the thing you look for in the real world is places where physical reality of the world will be recorded as metadata in systems kept by different people. And then you diff them. And like, that's one way to find a needle in the haystack. This, by the way, like, a worked example was in the presentation. Okay, there are two systems, there's three or four or five systems in the world that all know what is allegedly on that like bank statement. So, and it started with just one. It was at Bank of America, and then through the magic of Bank of America's IT automation, within 24 hours, they became a second independent copy at FinCEN. Now, in the real world, these will never differ from each other after this point. But even if there was a maleficent actor at Bank of America who changed Bank of America's database, they can't alter the FinCEN database. These are hermetically isolated from each other at this point. And now the story went to New York Magazine. Well, the statement went to New York Magazine, and it also went to the New York Times. And it strains one's ability to imagine that both the New York Magazine and the New York Times would collude in changing the archives of their fact-checking process if those archives became inconvenient. And it strains credibility past the breaking point to say, and whatever conspiracy of folks that could successfully puppet both the New York Times and New York Magazine are also able to puppet Bank of America while they're also puppeting FinCEN. And so every time this information gets copied somewhere, it gets harder and harder to change the record in the past. Cryptocurrency people have a word for this. They call it blockchain, and they have spent like $100 billion on this problem. You can also do it with slow databases because like some slow databases are kept in places of truth, and it is difficult to like root the entire trusted community at the same time unless you're writing Harry Potter. But Harry Potter is a work of fiction, and we allow people to do things like that in works of fiction. Very rarely happens in real life. Although, since I've said FTX a few times, if you were to ask me what incident in the United States of America was most similar in recent memory to someone successfully rooting almost all of our trusted institutions in a strikingly similar fashion and getting away with it just because he smiled nice, it's SBF, close co-conspirators, other conspirators, and like came very close to achieving political power in the United States. It's a crazy story, which is why we have to be like, reasonably rigorous around facts. Yes.
You've seen the address on the mortgage.
Yep.
Is it close to 1 Flatbush Avenue? Is that where you'd go? Sorry.
I went there.
Yeah. The address on the mortgage, is that
It's
very
not
close?
It is within walking distance on plausible paths between address A and 1 Flatbush Avenue. One passes other Bank of America branches, and one would ask the question, why not go into those? But in a world where the story is true and you're under immense stress, maybe you walked past one and didn't see it. Maybe you went to the one you went to last week, et cetera, et cetera. So if it had been like 16 miles away, I would have been like, gotcha. But it is not. By the way, these are public addresses. Like mortgages are public addresses. The reason why I'm not saying her address and why I would not encourage everyone to say, hey, you can look up this writer's address like immediately is, in a world in which she is a crime victim, that would be obviously not okay. That's obviously not okay even if she's not a crime victim and she wrote something that you don't like on Twitter, like blasting out her address just because the law makes that easy. Also not okay. Oh, a bit of like compliance influencer trivia for you. I am buying property in Chicago, and I know that property records in Chicago are public records. And I also have reasons why I don't want my address on the internet to anyone who searches for 30 seconds. There's a thing called a land trust, and for $300 a year, you can have the land trust own the property. It will be in the public records, and your address will only be in a document that is kept at the land trust, and someone will have to give them a court order to get that document out of them. So for $300 a year, you don't show up in this, which, by the way, is a commentary on the American political system, that we have land records which are public by default for the purpose of transparency. But if you are savvy and pay a trivial amount of money to relatively wealthy people, you can opt out of that. Transparency, but only for people who can't afford to be private. Commentary on the American political system, it is what it is. Yes?
Someone asked you about your p-value on the actual withdrawal. What would you put on other elements of the story? If you were to trade yourself, what would you trade at for New York Magazine actually issuing a correction?
Okay, so I'll give you one p-value. In that 5 seconds of first reading it and knowing that this was a style magazine, I was like, they don't have a fact-checking process at all. P 60%. And then my first email to them where they say, we actually do have a fact-checking process, they don't actually have a fact-checking process goes from 60 straight down to 0, like epsilon over 0. So contingent on me developing enough evidence to make it pretty obvious to intelligent people that, there are some problems here. Probability of a correction, 95. What's the other 5? Like, hey, you know how this works. It's an ancient story in the archives at this point, move on. And then there might be a cycle of like taking lumps on Twitter, and then maybe or maybe not, they do something in response to that. The manifest unlikelihood of 17-year-old, $72 million hedge fund did not cause a problem. The problem was someone at Bloomberg said, what the hell, in print? And then there was a reporting cycle, and then they still did not retract it. They changed the headline because they couldn't justify the number in the headline, but like, it's an unimportant human interest story. What do we care? They only retracted it after the individual told another publication that it was a lie. And so, like, that's the epistemology here. We can ignore it unless under the code in our social class in New York journalism circles, you force us to not ignore it. And so, like, running up against a pretty high bar for the amount of evidence you need to successfully get a correction.
So what probability would you put on the writer actually being scammed?
Like totality of the story being like basically the truth? I think I gave that one earlier.
Yeah.
Like a scam is having happened to the writer that like broadly matches it. A little bit higher than the whole story being accurate.
I noticed that's not a number.
That's not a number. What number did I quote earlier for I think there will be a retraction?
95. If you get the evidence.
If I get the evidence. But okay, I'll give you an actual number. $60. More likely than not. But like the other side of that is like far past what one would normally expect of like this 8,000 word news article being true or not. So that's where I am.
Got time for maybe one more question?
Yep.
Do you regret spending this much time on it, or would you do something like this again, potentially?
So I quit my full-time employment in January of last year. And after that, I found a game called Factorio Space Exploration and beat it. And that took And that took me 750 hours. So is this a better use of time than me playing the next video game that is not factorial space exploration for the equivalent amount of time? I think it is a better use of time. The thing that I worry about is a descriptively accurate statement. I also ran like core infrastructure for the United States vaccination effort in 2021, and that seems to be like a better use of my time than chasing around banking detail and New York journalism nonsense. So I'll return to that, but like I got a video game to beat still. Okay, and I guess we'll end on that note. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, Patrick.